In this lesson, we're going to look at conditions. So let's create a few variables and we'll assign some values to these variables. So we've got a equals 5, b equals 10.
This video is brought to you by EpiPies Academy.
And now we can create a condition. So let's say, for instance, if a is less than 10, then if this is actually true, or if a is less than b, so we can make these dynamic, we want to actually execute out this condition. So we'll do console log and let's just write some text in there. Condition is true. So remember, this is again going back to those Boolean values where we've either got a true or false representation. So if a is less than b, then we'll console log out that it's true. So we see condition is true. So what happens if we actually want to produce, so what happens if we are not matching this condition? So right now there's not a whole lot happening, and this is where else comes into play. Else gives us the ability to say, okay, well, if this wasn't met, so if this isn't true, we can actually output another piece of code. So we can say condition is false. So basically we can check to see if it's true, and if it's not true, so let's not make it true, go back out and refresh it, and now we can see condition is false because 55 is not less than b, but it is greater than, so this again will come back true because 55 is greater than 10. So there's quite a lot of options here of what we can do within our conditional statements, and we can also add in even more conditions. So let's say we want to make sure that a is greater than, or a is less than 20, then the condition is false, but then this second condition is true, and so on. So let's just copy that out and add in another else there. So condition is, so this would be conditions are false because it's going to check two different conditions. Second condition is true. So we have two conditions there, and depending on what we're returning here, so let's update this and make it that a is not less than b. Refresh that, and we see second condition is true, and if nothing is true there, or that actually turned out to be true, so let's make b even really big. So now we see that conditions are false because none of these conditions turned out true, so we ended up getting conditions are false. And this is how we can use conditional statements. If we've actually producing a number of different of these conditions, we can also use what's called a switch statement. So switch statement allows us to perform multiple different actions depending on what the condition is. And then of course here you can provide multiple lines of code as well, so we can have multiple things happening here if it is true and so on. So I think just turn that true again. So we see that we've got all of these conditions, so we can run multiple lines of code for these conditions as well. So let's say, for instance, we have multiple conditions that we want to check to see if it's true. So writing it this way is one way of doing it, but it can get very long, and this is where switches come in. So switches we can use for, and this is where the expression is. So if the expression a is equal to, and this is divided up via cases, so case, and now we want to see if it's 15, then we want to execute a block of code. So maybe condition is true, but maybe condition is case 15. And then what we also need to include within this is a default. So a default essentially allows us to just write something default within that console there. So let's skip over this. Just going to comment this code out so it's not interfering with what we're looking at within the switches. And we see that condition is case 15, so it outputs it because this was true, but we also see that false is being output. And that's because we need to add in a break So always remember that between the different cases that you're applying here, that you add in that break. And what the break does is that it stops the rest of the code from executing out and essentially sending out that default. So we saw that we have case 15, and let's do a whole number of them here so you can get a better illustration. So maybe this would be case 10, maybe this could be case 5, maybe this is case 1. And now let's update A to 25. So refresh it. Conditions are false. If this one has a value of 5, then let's refresh it, and condition is 5. So it matches this this piece of code, and it gets to render out that piece of code once it hits that. So break essentially allows us to break out of the switch, and it is important to keep that in mind, that when you do want to break out of it, that you do have an option to break out of that switch. So we can also use strings for the case. So maybe if we had C, or maybe just C, and we had a string value that we want it to see, if it's true, we can apply that instead of having a case, a numeric case, we can also apply and so on. So I'm not going to actually fill out too many of these, but so you can just get the idea there, and set a value for C. So it should come back condition 15, case 15 is true, because now it's matching this one if we change it to B. That second console log is going to output the matching run this set of code here, because we see that the string value is equal there and it outputs it. So maybe we should just make a quick update to that and see that we're outputting those values there from the case. And we could actually simplify this. So basically we could do something like this, and then just simply add plus C. So this way we can actually output that same piece of code, and we can get even more clever with our code, where so we've got that we're outputting the case condition, and this makes it a little bit more dynamic, because whatever the value of C changes, we're going to output change whatever that output value is. So that's another tip there, to make your code more dynamic whenever you can. Make it more dynamic, and just by dynamic I mean that make it flexible, changing with the different variables as they change. Let your code change and be flexible enough to change with it. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at looping. So looping is another essential core skill within JavaScript, and it provides you a lot of capabilities of rendering out multiple snippets of code, multiple lines of code, multiple times, and specifying how many times you want to render that out. So very useful, and that's coming up in the next lesson.